of your generation and your professional lives. It's not going to get easier before it gets a whole lot harder. There's a final exam. It's on January 22nd at 7:30 to 10, although we're not going to be kicking people out, in Makash Hall, room 10. Remember that the final determines 30% of your grade. 2/3 of the final is focused on the second half of the course, and 1/3 of it is cumulative, meaning a grand total of 1/6 of the final is on the first half of the course. Okay, in some sense, right? But a sixth is a sixth. So it's short answer essay, just like the midterm was. And 2/3 to 3/4 of the questions, just like the midterm, are common to all 6 sections. And the remaining 1/3 to 1/4 will be precept specific. All right? So the final's just like the midterm, except half again as big. That's what the story is. And worth half again as much. It'll be curved in the same way. And again, your grades will all be normalized by section. So to try to make this as fair as possible. There are 2 review sessions, one on January 17th from 5 to 6:30, and one on January 20th from 3 to 4:30. Locations will be announced on Blackboard well in advance. Your preceptor will also hold a review session for material restricted to your precept, and that'll also be on Blackboard. In addition, if people have questions, you should come see me. I'll be here, and the other professors will by and large too. I'll be here the entire month of January and the rest of December. And so come see me. If you have questions, don't hesitate. That's what my job is. So I'd be happy to work with you, particularly if you're worried about the final and want to make sure that you're on track. The best idea is to study early and come and have me help evaluate whether or not you are ready, right? In time to get ready, right, if you aren't, right? Okay, so I just want to go through and reiterate that this is not a world without hope, although it is a world that should concern you. The consequences from business as usual, from the nexus problems, are tens of millions of human deaths. It's really hard to get a number that's lower than that. There are all kinds of ways to calculate this, but it's tens of millions of deaths, sort of at minimum. And so in terms of just the body count, this is a world war scale set of problems. Mass extinction and quite possibly hundreds of trillions in costs over a century scale. It's a very large number. Again, it's very difficult to calculate. Hundreds of trillions, what does that mean? But if you actually start to add up damages, those are the kinds of numbers that you get to. But scientifically sound solutions are still open to humanity. You've heard us talk about them again and again. Less than 2 degrees of warming. Ideally, substantially less than 2 degrees. Stop expansion of agricultural land. Increase crop yields where they're still low with fertilizer. Reduce food waste. Encourage modest diet shifts, especially away from beef. Price water and promote trade in food, which effectively trades irrigation water. The technologies for all of this stuff are already available, and they are cost competitive. The one possible exception is the less than 2 degrees of warming. In the developed world, there's no question about it, we have cost competitive technologies. In the developing world, we could still use maybe one more device to make non-fossil cheaper than fossil, and I think we'll get it. Additional damages are inevitable. Even the greenest feasible solution includes a lot of problems. Maybe 10% of species lost, unless we somehow fundamentally change agricultural technology in subsequent years and remain affluent and rewild a large fraction of our agricultural land. We're on track to lose 10% of them just because of the area we've converted. It's pretty difficult to imagine escaping without millions dead. If you calculate how many have already died, it's a complicated business, but already the numbers are up in that range. Trillions of dollars in damages from the effects of climate change, I think, are pretty inescapable at this point already. And of course, because damage is a concave up function of cumulative emissions, the bad news is it's really dangerous to keep doing cumulative emissions. The good news is that any time you stop, you've averted worse damage than you've had already, all right? And so there's no sense in which something is too late, all right? Something's too late when there's no one left to benefit from stopping. In general, the really scary tipping points, the recent press notwithstanding, as far as the science knows, are at 3 or 4 degrees or above. There has been a lot of talk in the press recently about tipping points being close, but if you actually look at the scientific papers behind those, there's really not any evidence, right, that tipping point is imminent. There's plenty of evidence of damage. Yeah?
So if they're not imminent, what's up with that thing where you said that Greenland and the West Antarctic can melt at 1.5?
Yeah, so it's a great point, right? So that's the one graph that shows what looks like a tipping point. That was the one that was used in Paris. But again, if you go out 2 millennia, 2,000 years, that graph is a straight line. It's only 3,000 years and beyond that develops the kink in it that looks like a tipping point. And so the question is a tipping point 3 millennia from now a tipping point? All right. In my view, we could argue that it is, and I'd be happy to amend this, except for that one, the 3 millennia out tipping point. My own guess is that it's probably best not to make policy decisions based on what's likely to develop 3 millennia from now, when there's all kinds of dangerous stuff that's happening right now. In 3 millennia, either my guess is we are extinct or back to the pre-industrial, or we are able to terraform planets pretty easily, right? It's hard to imagine allowing our coastal cities to be lost at that point. They either don't exist or we're able to manage them. In any case, these tipping points are still serious, and the science could be wrong. That's the other thing, that this stuff is not well understood. In particular, deglaciation is still not well understood. And so when I say that there's no scientific evidence that these things aren't, there's no scientific evidence that one of these things is close, there is also no strong scientific case that I could make that they are necessarily far away, all right? I think they probably are, but I could not prove it in any way, shape, or form. It's dangerous having them lurking out there. All right, so the Paris goal is down here, and I think for a reason, because there's dangerous stuff up ahead, and you don't necessarily know how far the cliff is. You think you've got a little bit of driving room, but maybe not. Are you going to bet your kids' lives on it? All right, so, there are those who estimate huge damages right now. Kofi Annan, who was the 7th Secretary General of the UN, famously his group estimated that climate change is currently killing millions per annum and costing more than $1 trillion per decade. The methodology behind this isn't very well known, and there are a lot of sort of hyperbolic statements like this about the current. And while that's interesting, it's important not to get sucked in by it, because there's plenty of rigorous work that shows that terrible things are happening right now. And this is Sol Shang's work. This is some of it showing the relationship between current violence and changes in temperature because of global warming. The Paris solution, again, is to limit temperatures to substantially less than 2 degrees, like the dark blue dots right here. And that means we really have to stop emitting in countries like this one in 30 years' time, and in the entire world in just after that. If we want to get in at 1.5 degrees, we've all got to stop emitting in 30 years' time. I'm personally not confident that we're going to make 1.5 degrees. I think 2 degrees is feasible. If I had to guess, I think we'd overshoot that a little bit, but I think we'll claw it back. So I don't think this game is over yet. It's all about political will. It's about technological improvement. It's just about collective action is what it is. All right. The technological end game on this is now in hand for climate. It's an almost all electric economy with fuels either produced by fossil, where the CO2 is captured and stored underground, or where the fuels are produced from renewable sources. That means solar, wind, hydro, maybe nuclear, gas with carbon capture and storage. Cost is about what we pay for electricity today. One thing we didn't talk about in the course is just how variable electrical costs are across the world. In the US, the average cost per kilowatt hour is 12 cents. We're here. Denmark is 41 cents. Spain is 30 cents. Australia is 29 cents. I mean, there's all this range, right? And so right now in the US, even if you decided to put in a relatively costly technology, if you wanted to go all renewable, you wouldn't climb up to the electricity prices in Australia, for instance. All right. So I think this now can be done with no increase in electricity prices, but no decrease either, right? And if we get a cheap electrolyzer, energy will be cheaper and we won't emit. The elephant in the room in the United States is still Donald Trump. Donald Trump's administration is the only one globally that has a full frontal assault on climate. The Republican Party in the US has been the only major political party in any country that has been in climate denial for a very long time. They're slowly but surely climbing out of it. But if you look at the actions that are proposed at the party level, they're still in arrear. So this is a singular and, in my view, dangerous situation here. There is no reason why conservative political philosophy needs to be partnered with climate denial. All right, there is in fact the contrary. Right, so we've got a problem in this country, and the problem is that we want both parties engaging on solutions to these real world problems, but simply differing on how to, not whether they are real. The solution to the food problem is that we don't want to have new farmland or pasture. And so we've got to close existing yield gaps. We've got to increase cropping efficiency and reduce waste, and with modest diet shifts. I don't know if you've noticed it, perhaps not, because it doesn't show up in the online. One of the problems with demise of print media is that you oftentimes in online versions miss the paid for full page ads, okay? And the New York Times and the Washington Post and Chicago Tribune, a whole bunch of them have in the last 2 weeks had full page ads from some group called it's the Council for Consumer Freedom. And it's all about how terrible meat substitutes are and how many chemicals there are in them, and how just bad they are, how unnatural they are, and right. And if you look this group up, you can't find out who they are. Okay, but I bet I know who they are. I like the fact that they're afraid. Okay, so anyway, that's good news. Biodiversity. We've got an anthropogenic mass extinction that is coming from the combination of climate change and deforestation. I'm pretty confident we're going to halt deforestation because the countries, well, I don't know about that. I think that right now, Brazil is going through turmoil. And if the populist movement there doesn't settle in for the long haul, I think that the Brazilians are in the process of deciding to preserve the Amazon, right? Africa's a different matter, Central Africa. Indonesia is complicated. So there's still a problem there. But as a species, we are getting affluent enough to stop this one. And I think there is relatively widespread international will and increasingly domestic will to do so. The solution is, of course, to stop the climate change at less than 2 degrees and to solve the food problem without doubling agricultural land. Water problem is arguably the one that is likely to cause the most conflict, all right, internationally. But it's also, in some sense, the easiest one to solve in the sense that if we, every time a society has priced water, the water use has gone down by a factor of 10, sometimes 100. And so we kind of know what to do there, but the problem is that it's politically difficult to do. So the science is now able, with some reasonable accuracy, to predict the consequences of business as usual and the effectiveness of alternative mitigation strategies, sort of what you gain for stopping. And the required technology to actually make the changes is close to in hand or all the way in hand. And in developed countries, it's all the way in hand. And that's new, right? When we started the Nexus course just a couple of years ago, that was not true. So it's good news now. But that doesn't mean the job is done. The real impediments are already and will be in the future economic, political, ethical, and imaginative. All right? They're not, we've just about got the technology now, cheap electrolyzer, and we've got it all. Then the question is, how do we actually decide to use all of this stuff in time? And so with that, I want to turn it over to my colleagues. I think Mark Flerbet was next, but I don't see him here. And so I will simply ad lib. Why not? I got a microphone, you know. All right, so the deal with policy tools. Policy tools, as defined by an economist, consist of a bunch of analyses that are cost-benefit or cost-effectiveness analyses with scenario building, so that there are counterfactuals to any particular policy. It's this policy or that policy. Oftentimes those policies then define scenarios, and the scenario going out in the future allows you to do a cost-effectiveness or cost-benefit analysis. The policy instruments are always have something to do with either money or regulations, right? So you can price carbon, you can price forests, you can put taxes, or you can actually have some sort of cap and trade system. The important thing is to impose a price that the polluters pay to when they pollute, and to bring the externality then into the marketplace. Regulations, command and control is also an alternative. Those costs, the costs for command and control, are still borne by the economy. but there's no pricing that is sort of inherent in the regulation. Economists typically hate regulations, right? Typically hate regulations because they think they're inefficient. And I argued that the one really effective climate policy, if you want to look at something that's gone to endgame, has been technological subsidies for the last 40 years, which has provided us all of a sudden with wind and solar that's cheaper than fossil, and also supplied us with natural gas that is super abundant and inexpensive. And those two came from the government not particularly picking winners, but rather subsidizing literally everything, and then allowing the marketplace to pick the winners through the price decreases that market competition made possible because of subsidies created. And then the ones that were able to buy their costs down to enter the full marketplace did so, the rest didn't. And so I don't think that the economics community has quite taken that lesson on board yet. And I know Nick Stern, I've talked to Nick Stern about this. He was, remember the Stern and Nordhaus pairing that we talked about before? Nick Stern said, yeah, you know, you're really right, and acknowledges that they haven't done that yet. Education and behavioral change is one of the key and growing parts of the economics toolbox. There are lots of economists who worry about the human behavior, particularly the irrational sides of human behavior, and acknowledge that even when it is in someone's economic interest, self-interest to do something, he or she may not do it. And on the other hand, incentives that shouldn't be sufficient to cause some economically rational change in behavior oftentimes are. And so there's a whole field surrounding that. There's a woman named Elke Weber who is a senior psychologist / economist at the Woodrow Wilson School, who is one of the real leaders in that area. On politics, we had multiple lectures, both from Mark and then most recently from Bob Cohane, about how that policy process is evolving. Kyoto being a top-down process that left the developing world out, Paris being bottom-up but without effective teeth that created a club. Will Paris succeed? It's weak on incentives and transparency, but it's difficult to say right now. I don't know how we're ever going to know, because technology has changed so rapidly, it's hard to say what's going to happen. I noticed that the latest climate data that came out, you can sort of see where our trajectory is relative to various warming trajectories. And it looks to me like, with the latest numbers, in a non-recessionary year globally, that we've probably slipped down to something like 2.6 degrees on the current trajectory rather than 3 or more. And that would be great news, and that's a technological change that does that. So it's possible that in the end, we'll have a giant argument that we stopped global warming at some number, and some people will say it was caused by international policy, and others will say it was caused by technological change. And no one will ever know, and no one will ever know to what extent the technological change was induced because everybody was paying attention to it, and that was also reflected in the international policy. It's hard to solve this problem because it's a prisoner's dilemma problem. Everybody wants to defect. Everybody has an incentive to free ride. And so this means that coordinated international agreements with teeth are really, really tough, because it's got a requirement for global cooperation that is absolutely unprecedented. All right, so enough said about that. And I think now I can turn this over to Kian, who is here. He's right there. Put that on. Let's get this first. Turn that down to
Great. Well, So we've got to the final lecture. I want to summarize a little bit about what we've learned in moral philosophy. So the first thing I wanted you to get a sense of is exactly what we do as moral philosophers. And the idea here is that when we're thinking about evaluating the nexus problem and the solutions, what we want to do is we want to have these theories and we want to subject them to critical scrutiny in a very specific way. Okay, so how does this link into the lecture, the nexus problem in general? What I want you to recognize, there's an overarching message I've been trying to get across through these lectures. And that's that when we're doing these evaluations, we have a very, very specific part of the solution space that we're looking at. In particular, there's a very specific part of what we're evaluating. And that is, I want you to understand just how small a part of the broad variety of ways you could evaluate are. So when we started, I wanted you to get this idea of the last man. So here the idea is, should we think about the impacts beyond how they're within humanity's preferences, humanity's desires and pleasures and pains and so forth? But I wanted you to get this idea that we can think about damages to the environment and to other species as potential moral obligations that don't depend just on what we ourselves happen to value at a given time. But I wanted to go a lot further than that. I wanted to give you this idea of the scope and the idea of, well, let's see, the different scope of our theories of justice. I wanted you to see how we could think more systematically about the differences between anthropocentric values, about values that are informed by the kinds of species that are that have affective responses, psychological responses. And I wanted you to get potentially think about all the way to thinking about ecosystems as resilient and that our value as being contributing to these kinds of functioning ecosystems. Why does this matter? This matters because when we're thinking about the environmental nexus, the structure of this course has been in terms of anthropocentric, discounted utilitarianism. Those are very defensible positions. And they're, of course, we talk about them because that's how the policy discussion is set in this country and in many other countries in the developed world. But that's a very limited set of the things we could consider. We could consider more substantively future generations in a non-discounted way. We could think about the global impacts of our climate emissions in a more systematic, non-regional, more international way. We can think about our damages as not limited to humans, but as, again, to sentient beings in general, to living beings more broadly, and even to the ecosystems themselves. And so that doesn't necessarily have to change the way that you actually evaluate, but it should generate pressure to think about how we could change those evaluations and to be aware of a broader space of possible ways to evaluate. So what are the advantages, reflecting back on the course, what are the advantages of thinking in terms of discounted anthropocentric utilitarianism? And the major one is what we've discussed, which is that it's practical. That's the way that policy discussions work in this country. And so that means that you should be, as young Princeton students, you should be aware of these ways of working. You should understand that's how governments in the Western rich industrialized world, in particular in the UK and in the US most specifically, these are very influential in how we get regulation passed, in what kinds of environmental and energy policies we adopt. But I want you to understand how that could be broader and how the scope could change. So again, how do we think about damages over time? Do we discount? What are the different reasons for discounting? So we got that in the economics lectures, we got that in some of the science lectures, and we got that in this broader idea about how we think about future generations. We want to think about whether we're incorporating all of the damages that are global, or as has been suggested in the current policy discussion, in the Trump administration, it was the social cost of carbon was limited to domestic sources. That's something we talked especially about in my precept. And that's something that's really important because there's sort of a microcosm of a broader debate that's happening in our global society, which is, should we retrench and think about our national interests, or should we think about these global problems in this very global way, which would require sacrifices of sovereignty. It would require thinking about people, as we saw in one of the previous slides, thinking about expanding our imagination across cultures across the world. So what that means is that we need to think about how these structures look when we're trying to recognize the difference between these national and international imperatives. And then I wanted to get you to some slightly more abstract discussions of how to evaluate in the most recent lecture, which is this idea of what kind of currencies and which kind of patterns of justice might be relevant. So here we're thinking, should we be thinking about minimal rights? Should we be thinking about some sort of sufficient threshold that we should get everyone to, and that it's much more morally important, maybe even lexicographically more important to get people to that level? Or is it just sort of how we contribute either at a consumption level or how we contribute at a utility level to society? And these things are really important. You might think that they depend on our intuitions about what kind of resources we have available, whether we're in, so in one of the discussions, we talked about whether we should think about it after an impact or before an impact, how this would change what our intuitions might look like. As I said right at the beginning, the philosophical method has this reference to intuitions, but these intuitions might be highly responsive to what kind of troubles we're facing, what kind of institutions we have access to, and what kind of resources we have access to. And I think that came across through some of the iClicker questions as well. All right, so the last thing I want to say is, of course, watching out for moral corruption. So one of the things philosophers are really worried about is that we'll be motivated reasoners. We'll try to justify the kinds of social structures we have, the kinds of views we have, and we won't be sensitive enough because it's in our interest to not consider our impacts, our externalities on either the future or even the rest of the world. And that's something that's really difficult to think about, and it's difficult to get outside of our own motivations and our own norms and our own cultural biases. So what I wanted to leave you with was this sense that what we should be doing is trying to reflectively evaluate this relatively narrow framing of what we take to be important in our public discourse and what we take to be important in the kind of institutions we have. I wanted to bring you to the idea that we can have a broader, both across times and across places, and even across beings. So whether that's discounting, whether that's global versus local, and whether that's considering only anthropocentric values or sentient values or all living beings or even ecosystems as a whole. And in general, what I hope you were able to take away from my set of lectures is that the nexus problem is part of a larger set of evaluative structures. And we need to be careful and think about what are the strengths and weaknesses of those different evaluative structures and how we could defend or object to these different positions. Thanks.
Great, so just to make a few synoptic points. The first is to come back to a quote I mentioned early on in the course, which is a quote from Wendell Pierce, the actor Wendell Pierce, where he said that art doesn't provide the answers, but it can help teach us to better live life's questions. Life doesn't provide the answers, but it can help teach us to better live life's questions. And in this sense, the arts and literature section of the course, the thread of the course, is a little bit angular to perhaps the main thrust of the course. In a related vein, James Baldwin once said of art that art teaches us to look for the questions behind the answers. Art teaches us to help look for the questions behind the answers. And so what we've focused on in the lectures in this thread of the course is very much the power of framing and perspective and how the way we frame our answers and our questions has profound implications for the way that we understand the nexus question. And so one of the examples that we used was the example of the Anthropocene as a new way of conceiving the relationship between humanity and planetary change. And we, among other things, we looked at the biologist Anthony Bonoski's very dramatic assertion that we are the asteroid. This idea that humanity has collectively, if unequally, had a series of biogeochemical impacts that are greater than those of any sentient species in the history of the planet. And indeed, one would have to go back to the cyanobacteria to find biota that have had such an impact. So one of the things that comes through here is this idea of simplification, almost sloganeering, as a strategy to jolt people into a different imaginative, ethical, and political and technological space. And so one of the things that we talked about was what are the values and the costs of using a dramatic image like this to try to bring home the scale of our collective impacts as a species. We also talked about, in a couple of instances, the use of theatre to throw into relief the politics of the environment. And this is from Jason DeCaris Taylor's series on the Anthropocene. And we talked a little bit about how this is a kind of a speculative form of sculpture, undersea sculpture, where he uses the seafloor as a theatre space, effectively. And on the surface, he has the scuba divers looking kind of otherworldly, looking back on the present, on the car crash, if you like, of fossil fuel dependence, looking back on the present from some future point. So he's able to use the differences in light, surface, seafloor to help dramatize a temporal distance between the future and the present, which by this point has become the past. Perhaps particularly in looking at Cochabamba and even the rain, we talked about race and the question of environmental justice. And this is a quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates in the context of Black Lives Matter, but one that I suggest resonates across indigenous struggles as well. Racism is a visceral experience that dislodges brains, blocks airways, rips muscle, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth. You must never look away from this. You must always remember that the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions all land with great violence upon the body. So one of the things that the arts do, or can do very effectively, is to bring the graphs, the charts, the regressions, all of those back to the body, to the affective domain, to the felt domain, and to give it a physical and emotional life. And so I think that's one of the key roles that the arts can play in relation to social movements, for instance, is the imaginative translation of data that might seem significant, but a little bit abstracted from our daily physical lives to give it a kind of a visceral urgency. Finally, in the context of Wangari Maathai and the Greenbelt movement, we talked about another aspect of the literature and the arts segment of the course, which is the degree to which we're focusing on the crossroads between social movements and symbolic energies, if you like. And so we talked about, we talked in the context of the Jason DeCaris Taylor of the seafloor having particular forms of pressure, distortion, light distribution, darkness, that creating a certain theatrical environment. And we talked in the context of the Greenbelt movement of the degree to which the forest was utilized as a kind of a theater, particularly in the showdown between the women of the Greenbelt movement carrying saplings that they wanted to plant and the foresters who were using the same axes and machetes to illegally cut down forest from this public forest and to attack the protesters themselves. And that became a very, very powerful image. And in this context, we also talked about the ways in which the Greenbelt movement sought to animate what might seem undramatic concerns, life and death concerns that suffer from a kind of drama deficit. And so one of them is the fate of topsoil in relation to desertification and deforestation, and the way that Wangari Maathai attempted to reconfigure this as a kind of quotidian daily terror that posed a more dramatic, sustained, and immediate threat to the livelihood of rural communities in particular, with a special burden on the women who were responsible for providing fuel and water and nutrition for their families. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, folks. We are down to a clicker question and a summing up slide. When we first started this course, we had a cast of thousands. We had people coming in, the lead negotiator for the U.S. climate treaties. We had all these different people who were in the environmental justice movement. We had a very wide range. And the feedback was very much that there were too many, all right? And so we've reduced the number of outside voices. And, but what I want to do is still get some sense. And forget about question 1 and question 2. All I want to know is alternative voices in ENV200. Did you get enough perspectives from other kinds of people, all right? Not just people like us, but other kinds of people. And that's the question I'd like you to answer. So A is too many, B is about right, and C is too few. Would you like a lot more people from the outside who work in different ways in different places? We had Paula Kahumbu, who is an activist who comes from Kenya, but there could be many more Paula Kahumbus, and there used to be. And I'm just going to kill it and take a look. And the answer is about right. And then with too few. That's been the plurality after we reduced the number, but we had it was like essentially unanimous that we had too many. Okay, I'd like to end by, first of all, thanking you for being polite and for listening. I always like to acknowledge when students had been raised well, and you evidently were. So I appreciate, so thank your parents for me, or whoever raised you. I also want to say that the world really is in your hands here. Some of you are going to go on and actually dedicate yourselves to this collection of problems. The rest of you aren't, but you can still vote intelligently and remain informed. And for those of you who are going on, the most critical thing is to understand that passion isn't going to be enough. You've got to find the levers of power and learn how to pull them. I just can't resist making one last divestment remark, okay? So forgive me for this. But you can imagine that in the next year or so, a whole bunch of these big fossil companies, or some subset, actually a pretty small subset, is going to announce plans to move their product lines deterministically to net zero emissions. Shell has already announced that they're going to make this announcement within the next month or so. And there will be a collection eventually. Whether or not anyone divests, a group that could organize a significant boycott of those that won't start down the path to net zero would actually dramatically change the behavior of the whole industry. And a group that organized to do that, but also to track the progress and to continually revise the list instead of providing perverse incentives that would empower the worst players like the national oil companies, It would, in fact, drive the industry to be non-emitting faster than otherwise. That's the sort of thing that would make a difference. Whether or not Princeton divests might have a small impact on, shareholder opinion and on their boards and that sort of thing. You cut into their profits relative to their competitors, and everybody, the fossil fuel analysts, the marketplace, everyone is breathing down their necks. So, have at it and find the jugular and cut it. Say, yeah, bye.